on this computer. Okay, let's get underway with our next panel, and I'm very happy to introduce our presenters today. With us, we have Dr. Juan Rios, LCSW. Dr. Rios is currently a full-time faculty professor at Seton Hall University. He has served as the director of the Masters of Social Work program at Seton Hall. And prior to joining Seton Hall University, he was part-time lecturer at Rutgers University and ranked adjunct lecturer at New York University. Dr. Rios holds a Bachelor of Social Work degree from Southern Connecticut State University and an MSW from Rutgers University and a doctorate degree in social work from Rutgers University. He is a licensed clinical social worker, certified sex offender treatment specialist, certified hypnotherapist, EMDR therapist, and team CBT therapist. He also holds a certificate of nonprofit leadership from Fordham University and certified mental health first aid instructor. Dr. Rios is an immigrant, first-generation college graduate who was raised in an inner city community that was plagued with substance misuse, systemic oppression, and violent crime. He has firsthand experience on many social problems, including extreme poverty, addiction, homelessness, incarceration, racial discrimination, and intergenerational learned trauma. Dr. Rios has spent his career servicing individuals and families as they move through the process of change, and he is committed to healing communities through innovative therapeutic approaches and emphasizing the power of liberation of the whole person in their environment. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Rios. And also joining us today for this panel is Laura Bustamante. Laura is the Policy and Campaign Manager at the New Jersey Alliance of Immigrant Justice. Laura immigrated to the United States at the age of 5 with her mom. She was raised in New Jersey and has dedicated her career to local organizing work, electoral campaigns, and advancing progressive and inclusive policies for working families. She has previously served as Chief of Staff to Jersey City Councilperson James Solomon, Director of Low-Income Household Energy Assistance Program, the LIHEAP program at the Hudson County Latino Foundation, and was director of the Youth Vote for Congresswoman Mikey Sherrill's 2020 congressional campaign. Laura received a Master of Public Administration and Master of Science in Protection Management from John Jay College at the City University of New York. Welcome, Laura, and welcome to you both. Thanks for joining us today. We'll start with Juan. Do you have a screenshot you want to share, or do you need me to share something for you?
Nope, I think I got it. Could you see my screen?
Right. Yes, we can. Just put yourself on a slideshow view.
Okay. All right, how's that?
Perfect.
All right, fantastic. You can hear me okay, Jeff?
Yes, we can.
All right, just to check in, I have about 15 minutes or so. Will allow, and how much minutes time for question and answers within that time, or?
Question, 15 minutes, and then question and answers afterwards.
Perfect, perfect. All right. So first of all, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all here. I know you bore through that very long bio, so I will not say anything more about myself. Aside from being able to discuss a bit about what we will be discussing today and how it relates to policy. Today, we're going to be discussing 2 frameworks for building community, and that's where we shall start. So what I would like is for you all to begin to put in the chat box, what does community mean to you? So as you identify what community means, throw in the chat box. Let's see what folks are saying about what does that look like for you. Is it safety? Is it peace? Is it integration? What is community like for you? So I'm going to allow 30 seconds for folks to begin to answer that. What does it mean to me to have community? It's a very deep and important discussion, right? So I think it's excellent to sort of start there. And as you notice, some of the responses in the chat box, belonging, support, where we feel safe, showing up as our authentic selves, folks who you identify with, morals, I mean, we see all of these answers popping up. And I want us to begin to notice that, because we cannot think about policy without taking a liberated health approach, which means that in order for us to liberate ourselves from the systemic external oppression, we must also liberate ourselves from the internal oppression. And in order for us to liberate ourselves and liberate our communities from the internalized oppression, we must also work towards the external liberation of oppression that exists. So as we think about that, we have to always conceptualize it within the social determinants of health as we build community. So is there economic stability? Is there opportunity for good education? Our previous presenter discussed about equity in education. What do those disparities look like between communities? The access to health and healthcare, how we build environments, what are the social and community contexts? So when you think about belongingness, is that something that is created and cultivated? And how is policy and how does policy contribute to building out these 5 social determinants of health? Because we know how much it impacts, one, access to healthy options. So if we think about land justice and food securities, gentrification, is there enough parks in my community and neighborhood? And how does that impact wellness? How does that impact how I view safety? How does that impact closeness? And these are all areas by design. And I want to highlight that because so often we think that these structures are created for us, but we also have to be engaged so that we co-design and not have it created for us, but that we engage in how we design safety, how we design belongingness, how we design community engagement. And this brings me to the work I've been doing post the murder of George Floyd. So after the murder of George Floyd, many communities were asking, what is it that we can do in order to create safe spaces, right, for Black and Brown folks, to hold police accountable? And this is really going, we're going to go into now the tale of 2 cities. And one, it's South Orange Village, where Seton Hall resides. And as for many of us who know South Orange, the South Orange community, it is an affluent, diverse, upper middle class community that historically has been on the privileged side of redlining historically. And the community has come together and said, you know what, we want to do something. What is it that we could do? So we engaged in policy work from the mayor's level all the way and throughout the community level and say, well, what does it look like when we say everybody belongs in South Orange? And what I always highlight is that in suburban communities, so often folks have these lawn signs that says, well, Black Lives Matter, everybody belongs. But are we truly living our lawn signs? Are we living beyond our lawn signs? And really being able to hold not just the police accountable, because they only reflect who calls the police, right? They reflect the community. Therefore, if I live in a community of South Orange and there's young people coming to South Orange to visit the downtown area and the music is too loud, who's calling the police on these Black and brown young people? So there has to be a true comprehensive cultural shift and change so that when we think of belongingness, it's municipality, it's community partners, it's our residents, it's our neighbors, it's our visitors, it's those who work there. So as a result, the Community Care and Justice Initiative was created, also known as CC&J, and it's truly a platform where the South Orange community built out a subsection of its government that really focuses on being able to shift and change the policies that are created. How do we cultivate more mutual aid? What does it look like to be able to have a community that's fully engaged into the interventions from a municipality level, but that the community drives those changes? And what we were able to create really is to begin by starting with research, right? So often what happens during these movements is that we react from an emotional standpoint to change, but we don't ask the community what they want, because safety looks very different, as we just saw in our chat box, from community to community, person to person, value to value. And what we want to identify is be able to identify the values, assets, and needs of every community before we move towards intervention. So what does justice look like for a community? What does mutual aid look like? What does procedural justice? What are the perceptions of the police engagements? What do we find to be the most important areas that we as a community, as a block, view that we have to be able to strategically tackle? So when we think of houseless persons, we're not just identifying folks who are impacted by substance misuse or impacted by mental health. We look at it from how we reflect that specific community, and not give it a single narrative, that there's a complex narrative to it. So what are we doing? How do we utilize research and community engaged research to identify these needs? Which means that we also have to identify what the needs of our neighbors look like. For example, if there's a car theft that happens in South Orange, they have to drive through Newark to get to the ports to be able to sell that car. So if someone steals a car in South Orange, that is a problem, not just for South Orange, that's a Newark issue. So Newark's issues affect South Orange issues affect Newark, East Orange, Oranges. Communities are interconnected when it comes to social problems. So the concept to view that suburban communities don't have to engage in collaboration about the issues of urban communities and their neighboring communities is a falsity. And we have to begin to use research and engage research to identify the needs and move towards the process of intervention and change. And so we've designed this framework, which is one, beginning to utilize resources, integrating training materials for the community, being able to also engage law enforcement in more of a systemic way about what are the hiring practices we have, what are the cultural issues that have to be changed, how are the community involved in transparency into that process. Also, but moving into continuous assessment through academic research, through publications, and engaging the community in this work, that it doesn't just come from academia. Academia helps inform and support the community interventions so that the community drives the changes in which the municipality begins to engage in. So this is one of the different structural outputs that we had developed through the Community Care and Justice Initiative. That is, oversight comes from the Board of Trustees, but it also moves throughout the community, throughout the operations, so that there is a continuum of cohorts in the community which are educated into ways in which how we engage in mutual aid. For instance, if we're thinking about food insecurities that's happening in Newark, it's engaging folks in South Orange to work collaboratively with the community of Newark in order to exchange resources so that the community is engaged in addressing these social problems that exist across these false borders. Now, we already have moved through and completed the assessment piece, and we provided that outcome to the South Orange community. And now what has been created is the outreach program of Community Care and Justice Initiative, in which folks, after a situation may have happened with the law enforcement officers, meaning that there was a person who was in emotional crisis and had to be taken to the hospital, folks are following up to make sure that there's resources that are there, that there's resources for community members to prevent other situations from happening, and then being able to reassess what are the changes after a year, 2 years, 3 years, and 4 years, so we could replicate if this could fit in other communities. Now, some of us are familiar with this image. For those of you who are not, this is the actual location for the epicenter of the 1967 Newark Rebellion. And as many of you know, the Newark Rebellion really occurred as a result of many racial systemic problems that was occurring in the city of Newark, including white flight, including economic inequalities, as well as redlining. And it all came to a head when a group of police officers had attacked a taxi cab driver in 1967. And as you see here in this specific location, which is Precinct 1 in Newark, that was a location where these police officers were housed, and the community was in outrage over this injustice. And now this is the same precinct. And after the murder of George Floyd, Mayor Ras Baraka had decreed to divest $11.5 million of the police budget into committing that Newark become a trauma-informed city. So opening up the first in the city of Newark Office of Violence Prevention and Trauma Recovery. And this is the location of where this office is going to be held, is at the same location of Precinct 1, where that epicenter of the Newark Rebellion had occurred. And we're truly shifting the narrative of what safety looks like. That at one point, this location that has housed police officers is now the location where it's housing social workers who are boots on the ground, being able to provide both in crisis intervention as well as preventative services to the community. So we're looking at gun violence from a public health perspective. And that $11.5 million is going towards empowering already existing community programs such as the Brick City Peace Collective, the Newark Street Team, My Brother's Keeper, et cetera. So that way we're scaffolding the programs that have already been working in the city of Newark. Also, the funding is being put towards creating a community museum on social justice, so that we're highlighting the work and the history of Newark. So we're changing the narrative of the city. So we're looking at it from the great work of activism that has happened, but also, and rather than waiting for folks who were formerly justice involved to engage in another issue with law enforcement, what we're doing is we're outreaching with these individuals to figure out and see what are those issues, what are those social determinants that we have saw in the previous slide that are impacting them in ways that we can begin to address preventatively. So if someone was formerly justice involved and is at risk to reoffend, what we're doing is we're creating wraparound services for them, therapeutic services for not just them, but them and their entire families. Because what they will tell you is that, Dr. Rios, I don't want issues of safety to occur on this block. You know why? My baby mother lives right there in that house. My mother lives there in that house. So when gun violence happens on my block or my community, it affects us all. So what can we do? We need jobs, we need healthcare, we need access to adequate healthcare services. We need opportunities. Okay, there's trauma that exists. There's trauma that exists, economic trauma, there's interpersonal trauma, there's intrapersonal trauma. So being able to access these resources in real time is important. And this is what some of the interventions look like that have come out of this office and through the work collaboratively we have done. One is a Chop It Up program, and this program is moving into barbershops to engage with barbers in becoming trauma informed. For many men of color in the community, the barber is your therapist. It's your place of safety. It's sort of Switzerland, if you will. So why not empower barbers to be the first line of prevention so that they're able to identify what are some of the resources you can access, and creating safe spaces where we could deconstruct the stigma of mental health and help seeking, looking at wellness from a holistic perspective that just not comes from medication and sitting across from a therapist, but it comes through movement. It comes through holistic nutrition, looking at credible messages in the community of folks who are formerly justice involved as being those individuals who could penetrate those hard to reach spaces in our community so that they're able to engage in discussions about help seeking, healing circles, that being able to regain and reclaim our spaces of community in the way where we're using healing circles and ancestral healing work as a form of intervention. And I'm going to move on down, and I'm going to highlight again that we're collecting data through ACEs, through YCLS, which is current life situations and needs assessment, so that we're looking at the community from a resilience and strength-based model, so that as we engage in future self theory, which is when we are able to empower communities to view themselves in a positive light in healthy ways in the future, that we begin to make those changes today to engage in those future steps. So with that said, I want to just briefly close and open up for dialogue and discussions. I gave everyone a very fast and truncated version of what we've been working on for a few years, in which how we look at neighboring cities with different resources, different demographics, but engage them collaboratively into creating change. And I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll begin to open up for dialogue and discussion.
Thanks so much, Dr. Rios. I'm actually going to ask people to hold their questions for Dr. Rios for a few minutes. I just want to make sure that Laura has a chance to share her perspective on the issue she's bringing today, and then we'll come back for some Q&A at the end.
Thank you so much.
Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen, and I think just for the purpose of time, give me one second. Am I sharing the right screen here? Do you guys see my screen?
Yes, sorry, I was on mute.
Oh,
We saw
okay. That's okay. Okay, good. Okay, awesome. So for the purpose of time, I just want to I'm gonna go through some things a little bit quicker than others, and then if we do have any questions, we can just come back to that. So my name is Laura. Thank you again for having me. I'm here to speak about the Values Act, which is a state legislature bill that is currently in this legislature. I'm going to skip through here. So the most important thing I want to talk about is, so the Values Act really is something that I want to give an overview of ICE and limiting law enforcement and all of that. So why should a state like New Jersey be concerned about ICE? We are in a border state. We're not seeing a lot of like influx in immigration in our state, but however, New Jersey is one of the most diverse populations in the nation, with 1 in 4 residents being foreign born. Significant number of New Jerseyans are of immigrant heritage and have had direct contact with the immigration system within their household. So we've seen that mainly over like 250,000 New Jerseyans live with someone who is undocumented. And ICE has a significant operations here and in the region because of the diversity of our own population, as well as our proximity to New York City and Philadelphia. New Jersey has historically taken a two-part approach to ICE operations by offering access to programs in order to prevent marginalization and vulnerability, and by outright limiting ICE's ability to operate. But programs only are successful if people have trust in them. And ICE can only truly be limited if there are no loopholes open to individual interpretations. So some of the limiting enforcements that we've seen pass in our state are the local 287G bans, the Immigrant Trust Directive, public health emergency release credits. We've seen ban on ICE detention. And then we've seen the Essex, Hudson, and Bergen closures. However, we still do have one detention center that's left open, which is the Elizabeth Detention Center. And then we've seen status neutral programs. Again, that's that two-path approach, which have given municipal ID programs to undocumented individuals. We've seen professional licenses, driver's license for all, rental assistance, state tuition and financial aid, and hopefully we'll see upcoming healthcare. So cover all kids, and then limited COVID-19 relief. Despite these strides, ICE still operates without much inconvenience in New Jersey. We know that this is the case because there are both live examples and a wider perception and fear about accessing programs or services. So I want to open the conversation a little bit, I think mainly to a lot of people on this call, which is there's definitely gaps in the services that people who are undocumented actually end up applying for or using. And a big problem and why we have that is because people feel really unsafe. And the government essentially creates this sense of unsafety because people's data isn't protected. And so we've heard a lot of community stories come for us that says, I'm an undocumented mother. My child hit his head on the corner of the coffee table. He's bleeding, and I'm really scared to bring him to the hospital because I'm afraid of what they're going to do with my information or my child's information. And so then that leads to long-term effects. And this is really important. We've seen that as well with children and people in schools, and not, having a hesitancy to enroll their children in schools. We saw a huge effect during COVID-19. So people being afraid to go get tests, people being afraid to get vaccinated. And so we're seeing a trickle of long-term public health outcomes from this lack of insecurity, this lack of trust within our community. And so how do we address that? The way we address it is one step is through the Values Act. So this is exactly where the Values Act comes in. The Values Act provides critical protections that allow New Jerseyans to seek support from state and local agencies without fear of deportation. So passing the Values Act is a part of ending New Jersey's participation in the federal detention and deportation machine. So we've talked and we've seen a lot of great movements come out of shutting down Hudson and all the detention centers, and that pipeline where we're seeing undocumented individuals end up in our criminal justice system when they really shouldn't be. But we haven't really addressed the root cause of that. And so the Values Act addresses the root cause of how individuals end up in this system. So the Values Act takes the best intentions from the Immigrant Trust Directive, which is a directive that was passed by the Attorney General's office a long time ago. Again, this is a directive. So to be clear, directive can be undone at any time. We now have a new Attorney General. And so the Values Act takes the Immigrant Trust Directives, it pairs it with community learning, and forms its implementation. And it's done so through legislation, which is a lot harder to undo. So what we did was we strengthened the Immigrant Trust Directive because there was initial loopholes there. And then we put in an additional protections by making the Values Act legislation. And there's really three critical things that if we walk away from anything today about the Values Act, like I said, there's a lot of jargon and there's a lot of legislative policy wonky stuff that's in it, but the big things that it does and the way that it impacts maybe some of the people you're servicing, some of your clients, community members, friends, family, is it offers critical protections so that it really does build that trust for a mother to be able to bring their child to the hospital when something does happen and not be fearful that their information or data is going to be shared with ICE and or other federal agencies. It delivers accountability, so it holds the government accountable. Remember, this is a state legislature. There's a lot of things that happen at the federal level, but this is one level of protection that we have regardless of what happens at the federal level. And then it also goes a step further and replaces harmful language. So the bill itself is actually 77 pages. And the reason why it's so long is because all across our state legislation, there is the word alien or illegal used in our legislation. And so the Values Act actually goes in there and retracts that verbiage. And then I am going to put in, we have our Values Act, our one pager. So I'm going to drop it in the chat so you can see a little bit more. I'm going to drop it in the chat. Sorry, as I do this. So that's our one pager. If you visit our one pager, our action page and our action page, you'll see that the Values Act delivers so much more than just those 3 items. But I want to just be brief to allow for time for questions. Here's our action page as well. And so again, the Values Act, delivers a lot of these additional, again, I'm going to just highlight again those 3 top things. So it offers critical protections, both in interactions with law enforcement, but also at places like libraries, public schools, bus stops, shelters, state programs, agencies, and government offices. It delivers that accountability through robust reporting mechanisms, training, model policies set by the Attorney General's office, and it replaces that harmful language that others in our communities have experienced and are triggered by. And all in all, it restricts ICE's ability to operate in New Jersey. So where are we now with the Values Act? We are now at the stage where it's been introduced in the Assembly and the Senate, and we're working to secure more sponsors. So our coalition has been meeting aggressively with legislatures from across the state to get more sponsors, because the more sponsors we have on the bill, the more enthusiasm the bill has. The more enthusiasm the bill has, the less time until it becomes a law. And so we've started to gather supporters from all across the state, from northern to southern Jersey, central Jersey. And so we're rigorously meeting, educating legislatures on the importance of the Values Act and why it needs to be passed now, and the critical protections it brings to our communities. And this is just a very quick walkthrough of exactly where we need to go. So this is where we are. So our sponsor introduced our bill, and so it's now in the Assembly and the Senate, and it'll be up for committee, and it's going to be going to the Law and Public Safety Committee. And so that's why we're working really hard, because the more support we have before it gets to committee, the higher the chances are for the Law and Public Safety Committee to review the bill. And then once the bill is reviewed, it'll go into a second committee, which would be our budget hearing committee. And then once it goes from both of our committees, they both are parallel. So it'll be introduced in the Assembly and then in the Senate. And then in the Senate, once it goes, it'll go up to floor vote. And then if it passes, it'll then go to the governor's desk for signage. But the work is now, mainly because, like I said, we need a lot of pressure and support from our sponsors. And so one of the ways, so how do we get there? I want to talk a little bit about, there are a lot of ways to join our fight. And so you can be involved in as many or as few efforts as you have time for. But the first thing we want to do is make sure people know what the Values Act is. So if there's anything that you could do right now, the one thing I would love for people to commit is to tell 5 people that you know about this bill and why it's important and the critical protections it brings to our communities. If you have the bandwidth or really energized by this bill as much as I am, the second thing that you could do is you might think about writing a letter to your local paper. You might do like a letter to the editor. The second is we want our communities to be informed and activated. We must mobilize together, and legislators are motivated when they hear from their constituents. They're afraid of losing their support. And so we are in the same realm. If you have a relationship with your legislature, if you know your legislature, or if you can even send an email to your legislature, we have that action page that I can bump again for all of us here, that you are able to send out an email to your legislator urging them to pass the Values Act and support the Values Act. Another really important way that we're telling our stories about the Values Act is this is not just a legislation. There's people's lives that are at stake. There are people that have really experienced a lot of hardship because the Values Act isn't currently in place. And so we have a story bank in which we're collecting community stories from members of the community that have experienced domestic violence and have been really scared to report domestic violence because they think that their potential abuser might be deported or a fear of deportation. I talked about that system avoidance of people not going to the hospital, fear of enrolling their children in school. And so if you have come across somebody or a client who has this story, these are the types of stories we want legislators to walk away from our meetings with, that it's not this like a lefty immigration bill. This is actually a bill that is representative and protects the communities that live here in New Jersey.
Thanks so much, Laura.
Absolutely.
Oh, sorry, did you have more?
Yeah, just one more.
Okay.
And so I have our act now, and then updates and actions to stay involved. So if you want to scan those, but then the last thing I want to say is it does come full circle. So the larger a coalition grows, the scarier and more powerful we become, and the more sustained we are for our fight ahead. So if there are partners, supporters, co-conspirators who would be interested in a training like this, please let me know. You can also sign on to endorse the Values Act. I can circulate our letter of endorsements for anybody that would like to sign on. And then if you're looking to get more involved, I will drop, or if you have further questions that aren't covered for this segment, I know we're running low on time, I just will plug in my email. And so feel free to email me. Alrighty, I will stop presenting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Laura. And Juan also put his email in the chat, and Laura will be putting her email in there. And again, we'll share those contacts with you via email when we follow up on lead today. So we've got about 8 or 9 minutes for some questions. And I do see there's been some really interesting conversation and back and forth with some folks in the chat. But if you'd like to ask a question to Dr. Rios or to Laura directly, feel free to raise your Zoom hand. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to scroll through the chat and see if there are questions that we should pull out of there. I'm going to follow up on a question that looks like it was started to be posed by Lisa Lawson. And Lisa, if you'd like to come on microphone, I see that you brought up how the S512, the Values Act, could be relating to the bill that's going to be updating mental health service lines and making sure that we have support in the field for people experiencing issues that may not require a law enforcement response. I assume you're talking about the bill for the 988 suicide line. I don't know if you want to share a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Sure. So 988 is one of those, but there's also upcoming carve-ins expected with regard to Medicaid, which will support enhanced access to telehealth, which ties in nicely with not only the 988, but also a couple of other policies at the House and on the Hill right now in relation to social work safety, as well as enhancing crisis intervention services throughout New Jersey, which Governor Murphy has been verbally supportive of. The thing that I always kind of want to come back to with these questions is, you know, it's great in and of themselves, these projects, but there are so many initiatives, right? All these different policies and people that are attached to these different policies, but oftentimes they work in conjunction with one another, right? Kind of thinking from an integrated model. So I wonder if there is efforts or maybe you guys are already working with them to work with either those policymakers, or if you want to keep that politics piece out of it, different action committees that are also supporting the advancement of those policies. I know at least here in Mercer County, there's the Trent Health Team, which has been for that, the Mercer Public Health Partnerships. Ed Dobelman, he's the director of CIT training for New Jersey, which is crisis intervention training for police officers. Has also talked a lot about, and including yesterday, about person and environment and how important it is for officers to have that training. And they're now working with universities like Stockton and I want to say Rutgers on improving those trainings. And so, you know, both for Dr. Rios as well as for Laura, has that been something that you guys have thought about looking into, is maybe either reaching out to these crisis intervention folks, like the police departments that have are already on board with crisis intervention for mental health as a deferment from law enforcement or looking into working with the CIT program in New Jersey, so that you could be right there with the officers that are out there supporting these initiatives. So I guess that question could be for either of you, because you're, although different, the topics are very similar.
So I could jump in if that's all right, Laura. To answer your question, yes. So with the crisis intervention training that's out there, we have looked into collaborating with them, but what folks also don't know is that the commitment for training is where the systemic challenges are. So for example, when you have a small precinct, like in South Orange, where you only have about 40 members, and the crisis intervention requires X amount of your officers to be trained, that's taking them out of the field. And we have to also pay them in addition to any time extra that they're doing as per the union policies. So that becomes almost like a double, sort of like a double dip there that exists, meaning they're paid for the training, and we have to have somebody to fill in for that time that they're not there because they're taking this training. So we have identified folks. At the time, the system just didn't allow, because there was a lot of folks retiring, and there's a hire of about 8 to 9 new recruits. And the same thing in Newark. They had 2 massive recruiting areas where, so systemically taking other police officers out to do this training was not feasible. However, it is in the plan. It has been in discussion, and we are looking. We have been discussing about how do we integrate the CIT involved. The other piece that I want to mention is that, thinking about it from a law, well, not just law, but policy perspective, and our elected officials, let us remember that the real change that has to occur regarding how do we, train law enforcement officers to have more of this crisis intervention training at the training academy level, that is where it's essential. That is where those 40 hours a week should be embedded as a requirement, not way later. So as we think about who our next AG is going to be, we have to bring up these concerns and say, well, can we integrate CIT as a part of the training academy? Because that's where the changes happen, not in the local municipalities. So I advise and fully recommend us, as a collective group, to make sure that we think about those local elections, especially for the Attorney General, who can make those curricular changes at that level at the training academy, not at the municipality level. That's where we really need to focus.
I think
Go ahead.
I'll just add on, for us on the Values Act, I think that's a really great point. And it's something we should consider doing. We probably wouldn't get to those conversations until the Values Act passes and goes into implementation. So it's definitely something worth for us to keep in mind. I think it's a really great point. We're unfortunately not at the point where we can have those conversations. We'll need the Values Act to pass first before we can get there.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Dr. Rios, both for your comments. We are coming to the end of our time for this panel. It's going so fast, and I know I'm really enjoying these conversations. I hope you are as well. Just a couple of things I want to point out before we move into our last presentation of the day. I do want to make sure, Lizette Gonzalez, we do see your comment in there. Lizette is a policy intern at the New Jersey Coalition to End Domestic Violence, and we'll make sure to bring up the Values Act at the coalition. Many undocumented survivors would benefit from the legislation. Absolutely. And if you scroll to the chat, Lizette, you'll see that Laura's email contact is in there. So I hope you will reach out to her directly. And also, for those of you who may have missed attendance check number 2, the link is in there. Razia posted it at 12:10 p.m. So if you did not check back in after break, just look for that link and make sure you check back in so that we know you were here. Again, it's from Razia Cooper at 12:10 p.m. in the chat. So we are going to, again, take a quick 30-second or so stretch break, and then we will begin our next presentation.